And I am speaking with Lucille Eber from the Midwest PBIS Network, and we're going to talk about the key messages for intersystems framework connection. And that's not the right term for it, but Lucille's going to talk more about that. So welcome, Lucille Eber. Thank you so much for joining us, the NCLII scholars. And our scholars have reviewed this key messages document that you sent them. So you and I are going to talk about some of the challenges and maybe some good examples of schools in which you've seen these key messages being delivered, or progress being made towards achieving these key messages. Do you want to start with the first one, the first key message?
Excellent, thank you. The first key message, single system of delivery. And this message, when it's being enacted, looks a little different in different districts. And I'm also going to talk about states as well. And so my first example is actually a state example of attempting to not have siloed side-by-side, we do PBIS over here and we do mental health over here. So with our interconnected system framework, we actually want integrated leadership teams at the state level, as well as at the district level, and as well as at the building level. So an excellent example of that at the state level is the state of Wisconsin that has their whole PBIS network, and now they have a school mental health group funded by SAMHSA, and they put them together, and they only took schools into their school mental health cohort that already had PBIS fidelity at Tier 1, and they're building their school mental health professional development at the state level on a multi-tiered framework. So that's a pretty good example.
Cool.
What does it look like at the building level? Well, in some schools and in some states that have well-developed school mental health systems, there's separate school mental health teams and separate PBIS teams, and that's what we're trying to change. So in Charleston, South Carolina right now, in a couple of counties in Florida that are part of a random control trial study for interconnected system framework, they're figuring out how to not have separate teams and how to have one blended team that does Tier 1, one blended team that does Tier 2, and one blended team that does Tier 3 instead of handoff. So it's kind of a work in progress in many places, but the idea here is one system. Oh, by the way, we don't care what you call it.
Mm-hmm.
You can call it PBIS on steroids, School Mental Health Plus, the behavioral health system of the building, but language is important, and letting the teachers and the families and the kids know it's one set of teams and it doesn't matter what you need, it goes through there is pretty important.
Mm-hmm. Great, fantastic. And that's our first key message. What do you think about the key message of mental health is for all? Have you seen progress in the schools towards implementing and addressing that key message?
Oh, absolutely. That also is related to the fact that we want, in the interconnected system framework, community providers and people who traditionally had sat on separate teams to actually be part of the Tier 1 development. So mental health has typically come in at Tier 2, meaning kids who've already been identified as having a need and participating in groups or individual interventions. What we've seen in, let's take Elgin, Illinois, a perfect example, also in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where the community providers become part of the Tier 1 team and help bring community data to the table to intersect with school data. So, for example, in the early days of interconnected system framework, about 7 or 8 years ago in Elgin, the community providers that were integrated into the Tier 1 teams at some of the high schools in U46 were talking about concerns about gang violence, not just at school, but in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of ups the ante a little bit in terms of should we look at this with our Tier 1 messages with students and families rather than the community providers just being at Tier 2. Another example at the elementary level would be when the Boys and Girls Club or people who run after-school programs start delivering the same instruction with the same respect, responsibility, safety approach, and high rate of positive recognition to kids in the after-school program. So it mirrors what's going on in the school for kids so they have a smooth transition into the after-school program. The last example I'll give you are school districts who look at the demographics of the community at their Tier 1 meeting or maybe at their district leadership team meeting and see a case for installing trauma-informed interventions at Tier 1 connected to the core social-emotional curriculum that's often anchored on 3 to 5 expectations to create a positive culture in the building.
Cool.
So we've seen a lot of uses of social-emotional, air quotes, curriculum, and that's okay as long as the lessons are selected based on the data of the school and or the community versus having teachers just plow through lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3.
Right. Which just may or may not be effective.
Absolutely.
Well, you and I, before we started recording, we're talking a lot about access is not enough. That's such a critical key message, I think, for delivery of social, emotional, behavioral, mental health interventions in school. Can you give examples of, we were talking about a school district which has really addressed this key message?
Well, this is actually my favorite key message, and it's become my favorite mantra, and there's actually some colleagues of mine who roll their eyes and cringe every time I say it, because it truly is my favorite. And the issue here is in the school mental health and the mental health and the special ed world, we used to measure our whether we were successful or not by how many kids access services. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of federal grants out there on the mental health side that have written right into their grant requirements, increase referrals, increase access. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. We need to do that. But the point is that kids could be accessing services, and the services and the interventions could not be having an impact.
Right, or they could cause harm sometimes.
Or they could cause harm. Thanks for adding that.
Hopefully not.
That's exactly correct, Betsy. But so here's an example I'll have for you of progress not quite enough. It's a Midwestern school district involved in a PBIS mental health project, and they keep talking about increasing the referrals to the school mental health provider that they have a partnership with. And what we're trying to help them navigate is, instead of handing the kids to the provider, having the providers be on the teams in the building and dialogue with the school personnel about matching intervention to presenting problems and deciding before the interventions begin how they're going to know if A, it's being delivered with fidelity, and B, producing an outcome. And that's kind of a new dialogue for people who are used to just accepting referrals and going about their merry way with the kids. Another issue related to this that I think is important is language. I always think language helps bring the point home. So we are trying to get people to understand that mental health counseling is not a definition of an intervention. It's a category. Therapy is not a definition of an intervention. It's a category of types of services. And we want people to be very explicit. For example, we're putting these particular kids in a 6-week, twice-a-week instructional group on coping with anxiety or aggression replacement behaviors, whatever it is, it's explicitly named. There's a dosage, there's a frequency, and there's a methodology and tools and data points to tell if it's working.
Absolutely.
I'll give you a non-example and then an example. A non-example would be all the kids who are in any groups, we're asking the teachers how they're doing by giving them a survey every quarter about their grades, their homework, and their behavior in class. Now, 10 years ago, we would say, great, at least you're tracking outcomes, but I don't say great to that anymore. And now we want the different interventions to be very clear about how we will know if they're working or not. And When we move up to tier 3, just to give an example of layering, like we did in the last key message, when we get to tier 3, we add on data points of student perception, family perception, and teacher perception. Whereas when we're down at tier 2, we may or may not need to add that data point on. Another point that I would make that's really exciting is a lot of our schools are taking their higher level tier 2 groups, like a trauma-informed group using cognitive behavioral instruction with some psychotherapeutic techniques added in. And then they're keeping the kids on a daily progress report, for example, check and check out, if you're familiar with that.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just adding in the skill set, such as use your words or ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
They're adding it in under respect, responsibility, or safety. And
cool.
That way the teachers know what group the kid's in, and
mm-hmm.
they know what skills being taught, and they can prompt, pre-correct, and reinforce the behavior from the group in the classroom, and that helps with transference and generalization. There's a lot of examples that we could go into. If people have questions, I can provide you with more.
That's great. And I think your point prior to getting on to recording our conversation is one that all of our scholars can relate to, and that is access to a reading class or a reading group doesn't mean you're going to learn how to read, right? So we can think about it in academic intervention terms quite easily. We need to apply that same kind of thinking to mental health interventions.
Absolutely, and thanks for reminding me of my favorite analogy, because, just because a kid goes to reading class, we don't assume he learned how to read. Just because a kid was in a mental health or behavioral intervention, we don't just assume they picked up the skills. We actually have to check to see if they do.
Right, that's fantastic. And then your other key message is use an MTSS framework?
Right. So the framework allows for systematic implementation. So if you're familiar with Dean Fixon and colleagues' implementation science framework,
mm-hmm.
and if people aren't familiar with that, basically before you implement an intervention, you explore, adopt, and install. And installation means you have teams that are going to monitor it. You have database decision making, and any interventions that you're going to choose have to have a research base that shows there's a high likelihood the intervention is going to produce a result for the presenting problem. And so we call that a continuum of linked evidence-based practices. So in our previous example, if the student is learning to use their words and ask for help as part of a coping instructional group, we link that back to the instruction of respect, responsibility, and safety. So we link the higher tiered interventions back down to the lower tiered. That's a very important feature of a multi-tiered system framework. Some people are confused and think multi-tiered just means we do something for all, something for few, and something for some, and something for a few, which is correct,
mm-hmm.
but they have to actually be linked.
Mm-hmm.
The good news is mental health interventions, behavioral interventions for kids with mental health needs, operate off the same evidence base, which is an instructional base. The other key features, screening, multi-tiered screening in an interconnected system framework. We're trying to combine the screeners and knowledge from the traditional mental health world in screening and from the educational world. So PBIS often people screen pretty well at tier 1. We want to move people beyond only using office discipline referrals for screening and move into screeners that differentiate and find kids with internalizing issues as well as externalizing issues. And we want to continue the screening up through the tiers. The mental health world typically screened only at tier 2 for specific issues.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're seeing schools, for example, one school that's in a project we're working with, screen for anxiety among all 6th graders as a tier 1 screening.
Interesting.
Screening for depression
mm-hmm.
among all 9th graders as a tier 1 screening.
And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because from research, when kids reach early adolescence, that a lot of kids might experience some symptoms of depression or some nothing that can necessarily fall into the clinical realm, but some kinds of symptoms, as I said, that really are very responsive to intervention. But if you don't know about these, you can't help the kids, right?
And the screening is tied to the other features of a multi-tiered system of support, which is ongoing progress monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, one I already mentioned, database decision making and a continuum of evidence-based interventions. The screening leads to that, but also ongoing professional development and coaching for the people delivering the interventions to make sure that the interventions are delivered with accuracy and fidelity, and that the people who deliver them are actually fluent in them. So just quick review, the features are team-based decision-making with data, a continuum of linked evidence-based practice, comprehensive screening, which I probably should say first, ongoing progress monitoring, and ongoing professional development and coaching. Those are the key features of a multi-tiered system framework, that the interconnected system framework, bringing mental health into and using those systemic features.
Great, fantastic. I want to conclude with one question that's really at the heart of this consortium, the work of this consortium and the center and all the students and faculty, and what we're all trying to do here, which is improve the quality of services that we can provide to students with disabilities at Tier 3, kids who might not respond, they need to be in schools with excellent multi-tiered systems of support in place, but they need something more in addition to that. So the kids with IEPs, for example, how do you see the IEP process as part of this, or special education as part of this, as linked to some of the successes that you're trying to achieve in the linked multi-tiered systems of support?
Well, that's a really hard question. Sorry, because my first answer is going to be, I actually cringe at this question.
Right.
A little bit.
How about what can we do? What can we...
Well, the reason I cringe is because kids with disabilities, identified disabilities, should not be treated any differently than other kids in terms of accessing interventions that are likely to produce an outcome. Unfortunately, in special education, we have habits where we match certain, air quotes, services to certain disabilities, and we're not paying close enough attention to see if the actual services are producing a result. We have a history of thinking a place and a teacher with a certain credential is an intervention. And so one of the things that we need to look at is numbers. So let's play the number game here for a moment, okay? The percentage of kids who are typically identified as having, let's say, an emotional and behavior disability averages nationally at 2%. Some places are a little lower, some places are a little higher. The number of kids that we've known for decades, and now this literature is becoming even more prominent, that will have a need for a social, emotional, mental health, whatever you call it, intervention during their school career is closer to 20%. So the kids with disabilities that are identified with emotional and behavior disabilities, historically and still today, have the worst outcomes of any group, and we're not even finding half of them.
Right.
So the idea is to make the entire school consistent, predictable, and safe for all kids. And it's a place for kids with disabilities are more likely to do better.
Absolutely.
Kids with disabilities need to be part of the entire multi-tiered system and get the interventions they need, whether they're on an IEP or not. Unfortunately, we see the IEP process erroneously prohibit access to developing interventions in the building because people say, oh, they're in special ed, they'll get this, that, or the other. If we can make our schools shoot to be successful with the kids, the aim should be to be successful with the kids with the highest needs inside every classroom. Our kids with disabilities are going to do better. The IEP process as an isolated process has produced very, very poor outcomes, and part of it is because the IEP process is not constructed for good intervention design. So let's go there for a minute. What does an effective intervention for a kid with a Tier 3 behavioral need look like? There's an individual team just for that kid with people who are chosen by the kid and family because they're connected to the prioritized needs identified by the family. And those people meet regularly, meaning sometimes in the beginning, every week for 2 to 3 weeks, then once a month, always constantly checking to see if the interventions are working, if the kid feels successful, if the teacher feels successful, if the family feels successful. This once a year or every 6 months is kind of ludicrous. We need high frequency meetings, constantly monitoring if the interventions are linked to natural environments are working, and if the people in the natural environments who work with the kid, including the kid, are experiencing success from their perception. So if we transfer the core features of a good Tier 3 intervention into the IEP process, that would be great. But IEPs, once a month, focused on compliance, focused on places, does not dig deep enough on the features of effective intervention. High-frequency meetings, voice choice, person-centeredness, constant progress monitoring, and refining and tweaking of evidence-based interventions to ensure success. Aren't you glad you asked me that one last?
I am. That's a great way to end the recorded part of our conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Lucille, and our scholars will have access to your email address. I hope if they have specific questions for you, and all of the webinars that are available on the National PBIS website.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.